touch of a button now, with Findmypast, you have a greater chance than ever to rediscover those Scottish kin and tell your family's role in the story of Scotland. We have one more speaker to go and one more story to tell. But for this, we call upon someone that has been a long-time friend of Findmypast and a passionate advocate for family history, particularly by serving an inspiration to school children across the country as a director of the charity Making History. But he's also a master of his craft as an actor and storyteller. He's been in every staple of British television you care to name, from Midsummer Murders, Doctor Who, Bob the Builder, and many more, including something very close to the heart of our parent company, DC Thomson, Dennis and Nasher. He's best known for his work as Commissioner Lowe from the Christopher Nolan movies Batman Begins and The Dark Knight, but you'll probably most recognise him as the character of Ulysses from the most iconic Scottish historical series ever produced, Outlander. It's my great pleasure to introduce Colin McFarlane.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I've been given the task of being tonight's final guest speaker, and so I thought I'd round things off with a story that I hope can bring to life in a very personal way both my Scottish and family history hats off, with both my Scottish and family history hats off. You might know me from a number of roles across stage and screen. Miko just referred to a few of them, but none could be more relevant than the role of Ulysses, a character I portray in the TV series Outlander. More of that in a moment. My Scottish connection continues with the fact that I'm also now father to two Scottish children, brother and sister, Johnny and Em, who lost their Scottish mother to cancer, and sadly their English father, had to be English of course, rejected them when they were about 15 and 12. I met them through my eldest son a year or so later, and they've now been a part of our family for 11 years. The importance and impact of names, family, and identity were underlined when my beautiful alabaster-skinned ginger-haired daughter, Em, surprised me just 2 years ago when she, at Christmas, decided to change her name by deed poll to McFarlane. And I'm not ashamed to say it made me cry. Since we took her and her brother into our family, everything Scottish seems to come towards me. Securing the role of Ulysses in Outlander, a series set in Scotland, filmed in Scotland, and with a Scottish story at its heart, underlines all of that, as does being here today. Not to mention staying in Glasgow and having a wonderful breakfast with Billy Connolly and a wonderful evening with Annie Lennox. I believe our identity and sense of belonging is crucial to us all. Personally, I can't get beyond my own grandparents and my family tree, which brings me to my family history story that I want to tell you today. Around 10 years ago, I was directing a reading of a play where a young Black kid of around 14 discovers that the first person to the North Pole was a Black man called Matthew Henson. He can't believe it. He Googles it and discovers it's true, and it changes the whole way he looks at his life. I thought, wouldn't it be great if children of all ages, cultures, backgrounds could delve into their family and cultural history and be similarly inspired? From that seed, the Making History charity project was born, and the likes of Jim Broadbent, Miriam Margulies, and Shobu Kapoor joined me in schools to help inspire the children. We tasked children in 16 schools across Lincolnshire and London in 2 pilot programs to research their family and cultural histories, with guidance from a team of genealogists and support from the wonderful Findmypast. We asked the children to make a short 5-minute movie about something they found. The aim of the project was to break down barriers of race, culture, class, and gender. And my dream is that one day it'll be part of every school curriculum. Through their research, they each discovered things about their family and cultural history that many of their parents and grandparents didn't even know. Sharing their stories with each other proved a great way to educate, increase tolerance and understanding, and give them a real sense of pride in who they were. Our motto is everybody has a story, and even though a lot of the kids didn't think they'd find one, each and every kid found something to be proud of. The students' movies can be seen on our website, makinghistory.org, if you want to take a look. Which brings me neatly to the story that Findmypast have asked me to share with you today to mark the launch of this incredible new resource of 11 million Scottish parish records, to help more families uncover the power and magic locked away in their past. It's the story that I'd never heard of, that Miko told me about only a couple of days ago, and has fascinated me all day. It's the story of Scipio Kennedy, whom I'm sure many of you will know, as there's lots of family history societies and companies here today. Scipio Kennedy was a man who had strong similarities to Ulysses, the character I play in Outlander, and who became a Scottish hero. Both were born free men who were kidnapped and sold into slavery. I spoke to the writer of the Outlander series, Diana Gabaldon, earlier today, and unbelievably, in her next Outlander novel, Go Tell the Bees That I'm Gone, which is due out in November, She told me that she also has a new character who's another freed slave and unbelievably is called, you guessed it, Scipio. Now that's hot off the press, as none of the hordes of Outlander fans have got their hands on the book yet, so you've got a sneak preview there. Now, every one of us has 2 parents, 4 grandparents, and so forth, until we stretch back into history, and the number of potential ancestors reaches the thousands, hundreds of thousands, and even the millions. Every single one of them has a story, and every single one of them contributed, and even in some small part, to making you who you are today. Scipio's Scottish story begins at Culzean Castle in Scotland, a story from the past that has tentacles reaching into the present. The story of a man who was an ancestor, perhaps even to some people watching and listening tonight. At the castle, there's a long list of names on the wall outside its kitchen. It's a list of some of the servants' names that worked there over the centuries. And the first name listed is unlike all the others. It's Scipio Kennedy. The story of this name on a Scottish castle wall truly begins in 1694, when he was born in West Africa. We don't know his original name or anything about the first 5 or 6 years of his life, only that in 1700, he was captured in Guinea and sold into slavery. Much like Ulysses, from this point, his own cultural heritage was erased. The journey from Guinea to the Caribbean was referred to as the Middle Passage, where many adults struggled to survive the 1 to 6 month journey. When we hear what this 5-year-old would have experienced, it's incredible to believe that he even survived the journey. A typical journey would be described as follows. The stench of the hold while we were on the coast was so intolerably loathsome. The closeness of the place and the heat of the climate, added to the number in the ship, which was so crowded that each had scarcely room to turn himself, almost suffocated us. This produced copious perspirations, so that the air soon became unfit for respiration from a variety of loathsome smells, and brought a sickness among the slaves, of which many died, thus falling victims to the improvident avarice, as I may call it, of their purchasers. When the ship had much motion at sea, they were often miserably bruised against the deck or against each other. I have seen their breast heaving with all those laborious and anxious efforts for life. He was shipped to the Caribbean, but this little boy's story doesn't end in the sugar plantations of the West Indies. After surviving the grueling Middle Passage, where up to 15% of slaves died, he's purchased by Captain Andrew Douglas of Mains, Dunbartonshire, and taken to Scotland, arriving as an 8-year-old in around 1702. It's likely that Captain Douglas purchased him to be a personal or household servant. Young African male servants, often slaves and often page boys or footmen, were viewed as status symbols in Britain. This can be evidenced by their presence in many aristocratic portraits of the time. The name Scipio is neither African nor Scottish, it's Latin, but it was likely to have been given to him by Douglas at some point in these 2 years because it fits into a slave naming tradition of the time, using the names of powerful leaders to mock the slaves' powerlessness. In Scipio's case, it was probably named after the Roman general Scipio Africanus, conqueror of Hannibal and one of the greatest military strategists of all time. Although we don't know a lot about Scipio's life after being bought by Captain Douglas, we do know that he lived with him for about 3 years before moving with Douglas's daughter Jean to a home in Edinburgh and then Ayrshire with her new husband, Sir John Kennedy. It's presumed that Scipio, during these years in the Douglas home, was Jean's page. He probably worked in this role with Jean in various locations until 1710, when Sir John inherited Culzean Castle and they moved there. He served her dutifully and was held in high regard. We know he was given an element of an education by the family, and when Jean Kennedy, the mistress, he had served for so long, died in the 1750s, she left to Scipio Kennedy, my old servant, the sum of £10 sterling, around the same amount of money that she gave to each of her grandchildren. Can we now have the manumission contract on the screen, please? It's likely that Scipio was sign illiterate and couldn't read or write extensively. The greatest evidence for this is the lack of his own writing. There's no surviving documentation that illustrates he could write much more than his own name. We do have, however, direct evidence that he could do that, as he signed his manumission contract, the contract that freed him from enslavement. However, his signature seems painstakingly written, particularly compared to Sir John's, which you'll see underneath it. Scipio's signature is shaky, uneven, and his name is misspelled Scipio Kennedy. It looks as if it was signed by someone very old or very young. but he was around 30 at the time. It's difficult to know why the Kennedy family gave him his freedom in 1725, but the contract states that Scipio might have freedom by ye law on account of embracing ye religion of ye country. It seems, therefore, it happened partly because he'd become a Christian and had been baptized. The document talks of the more than ordinary kindness given to him by the Kennedy family. It's impossible to know for sure what that really means when the document's written by the oppressor. But one thing we can see here is that he can work where he likes and for whom he likes. He earns money for his efforts and gets a fair amount for the work he gives. And for the first time, he's free. But again, what did that really mean? Scipio supposedly now had the freedom to leave the employment of the Kennedy family, but this is unlikely in reality. Where would he go? He'd been brought by force as a young child to a country where his skin color made him a second-class citizen. He agreed to work for them for at least another 19 years and to be paid the sum of £12 Scots money yearly, besides my share of the drink money, which seems to refer to the smuggling enterprise occurring at Culzean at the time. This salary was not unreasonable, but it was still a very low wage, as around £40 a year was needed to support a family, and he'd go on to have 8 children. In 1725, the year of his freedom, the Atlantic slave trade and the institution of slavery was still in full swing. In addition, the Kennedy family had immense political power in Scotland. Even if Scipio had felt maltreated by them and wanted to leave, as a lone African man in a rural Scottish community, his fate was likely to be at their mercy. With no savings, since he'd never been paid, his new so-called freedom would mean that his day-to-day reality changed very little. He couldn't be free as we might think of it today. Were Sir John and Lady Jean Kennedy benevolent masters who were progressive in their treatment of a slave? Hard to tell. When considering elements of history that seem positive and progressive, such as the manumission of slaves or the abolition of the slave trade, we have to remember that the slave-master dynamic changed very little. Something I have personal experience of in Outlander was we had a scene where a slave was lynched and we had to discuss how would I deal with it. And you have to remember that you're a product of your time. And I had to take off my 21st century hat and remember that the slave had to go with the status quo or he'd be dead. There were numerous societal and legal forces in the Kennedys' favor that allowed them to still benefit from Scipio's displaced life, even after manumission. These forces probably kept him firmly in the Kennedys' employment and certainly in a position of subservience. We should not presume to assess the relative freedom of a slave based solely on a manumission contract. He was found, as we see in records on Findmypast, which we saw some of earlier, in what we innocently call an anti-nuptial relationship. In 1728, records show that he was found guilty of fornication with a local girl named Margaret Gray. This was a scandal, copied into the registers of the Kirk Sessions and now indexed, searchable, and this allows us to keep telling this story. Margaret had given birth to a daughter, Elizabeth. Scipio did the honorable thing and married Margaret, and there seemed to be no discernible adverse reaction at the time to the fact that they were an interracial marriage. Race, as we conceptualize it today, is a social construct largely meant to categorize people into groups based on physical characteristics, social relations, ancestry, etc. However, this was not a widely held view in 18th century Britain. Scottish philosopher David Hume wrote in 1742, when Scipio and Margaret had been married for about 14 years, he wrote, "I'm apt to suspect the Negroes, and in general all the other species of men, to be naturally inferior to the whites." Black people had lived and worked and married in Britain for hundreds of years before Scipio and Margaret's time. As I said earlier, they go on to have at least 8 children who we can now also find easily online. And that means we can continue their story. We know him to have had descendants living today. Can we now have the memorial picture on screen, please? Incredibly for that time, Scipio lives to be 80 years old. The money spent on his memorial by his son indicates the degree of love and affection the whole family held him in. No money was spared from their meager earnings as weavers. Both father and son were weavers. Think of how many people can have a tale like this in their family history without even knowing it, especially now that we have access to all these Scottish records. Can we have the manumission document on screen again, please? Let's look at that manumission document one more time. Let's look at his signature. Think for a second about this young boy with a new name, taken thousands of miles from his home, separated from his family and given no free will, subjected to the very real possibility of enduring horrific cruelty on a daily basis. Look at the penmanship here and think about this event. Imagine how important this writing of his name is to him. I know my character Ulysses has this moment, if you haven't watched the series, in season 5, I think episode 11, when I produced my manumission letter. And I know that in that story, I've had it hidden very safely for a long time, and no one knows that Ulysses is actually a free man, but he hides his freedom to stay with the woman he loves. It is, of course, a drama. Imagine Scipio taking his time, trying his best to make this perfect, or perhaps even just savoring the moment. This is a life event. It's a feeling you can almost imagine yourself if one were able to trace one's finger over the ink. Now, imagine your wedding day, the day you said goodbye to a loved one, the baptism of a child. These are all life events too. These are the events that matter, the events that define us and define our stories. This Findmypast collection isn't made up of the lords and ladies who swanned around, but the everyday folk who worked their fingers to the bone and made the modern Scotland we know today, and in some cases, the modern world. Scipio Kennedy was a man who was born free, although being born so many thousands of miles away, became a Scotsman through and through. A man who, because of these records, continues to leave his mark on Scotland today. It's said that as long as we remember a person, they're not really gone. Their thoughts, their feelings, their memories, they become a part of us. I'm so proud to be here with all of you today, celebrating the fact that thanks to records like this new collection, we can ensure that so much more of Scottish history never dies. I'm excited too that literally just yesterday, having spoken to Miko and told him that there was a rumor in the McFarlane family that there was a doctor in the family somewhere, Miko did a little bit of searching. It's kind of incredible. I'm kind of freaked out, so I've never got beyond my grandparents. But Miko has now found that there was a Scottish doctor at a plantation in Montego Bay in Jamaica, where my father and his side of the family are from. And he's found his name and a little bit of information about him and where he's from in Scotland. We're going to be doing more research on this after this event. So we discovered that he ran this plantation, and he, I think, died on his way back to Scotland in 1837. But of course, as you know, all the slaves took the name of their slave owner. So I am directly related to this man, which is quite extraordinary. So after this, I can now hopefully uncover my own Scottish story, whose roots will no doubt not be dissimilar to that of Ulysses and Scipio. And maybe I might officially be able to eventually call myself a Scot. Who knows? Anyway, that was a journey that Miko sent me on yesterday. And I went down that, as you all know as historians, that sort of rabbit warren of starting on a person's name and then researching around it, and suddenly uncovered that. And then in the midst of it, Miko said, I think I found where you're from too, or indirectly. So it's been a pleasure to be here today. And thank you for inviting me. And I hope the story of Scipio has given all of you a little inspiration.